When Michael Landon walked out from behind the Tonight Show curtain on the evening of the 9th of May 1991, something happened that 300 people in that studio had never seen before. Johnny Carson, the man who had hosted 30 years of television and interviewed every legend Hollywood ever produced, stood up from behind his desk before Ed McMahon had finished the introduction, walked to the edge of the stage, and wrapped both arms around his guest before a single word had been exchanged. He held on for a beat longer than any embrace Carson had ever given on that stage. When they separated, both men's eyes were wet, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The audience of 300 people inside NBC Studios in Burbank went into a silence that had nothing polite about it. It was the silence of people who understood, all at once, that they were witnessing something that could not be taken back. Michael Landon was 54 years old. 31 days earlier, doctors had told him he was dying. Pancreatic cancer, inoperable, aggressive, the kind that leaves no room for negotiation. What almost nobody knew that night was what had happened 40 minutes before the cameras rolled in a quiet green room on the second floor of that building, where two men who had known each other for 2 decades sat together without an audience, and Michael Landon reached into the breast pocket of his dark blazer and pressed a folded piece of paper into Johnny Carson's hand. Not a letter from his publicist, something he had written himself, by hand, at the kitchen table of his Malibu home the night before. With the Pacific going dark outside, and his wife Cindy asleep down the hall, and the silence of the house pressing in on him, he pressed the paper into Carson's hand and said, "Read it after, not before." Just after. Carson looked at the paper. He looked at his friend. He said, "Nothing," which was exactly right. He put the paper in his jacket pocket. They walked toward the stage together, and everything that was about to happen was already written. If this story has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, because this story belongs to everyone. Michael Landon was not born to be a legend. He was born to survive one. His name at birth was Eugene Maurice Orowitz, and he came into the world on the 31st of October, 1936, in Forest Hills, Queens, New York, the son of a Jewish father and an Irish Catholic mother, whose dreams had come up short and who never entirely made her peace with the fact. The family moved constantly, following work from New York to New Jersey to California, and the home Eugene grew up in was the kind where a child learns early to read the temperature of a room before entering it. His mother was beautiful and fragile and given to depressions that swallowed months whole. When Eugene was a boy, he found her in the bathroom after she had taken pills. He was 11 years old. He saved her. He stood in that bathroom and understood in one terrible instant that the people we love most can be the most capable of vanishing. Anyone who later watched him play Charles Ingalls on Little House on the Prairie and wondered where that particular tenderness came from, the quality of a man who held his family like he always knew how fast they could be taken, had their answer right there in Collingswood, New Jersey. He found his way through athletics. In high school, Eugene Orowitz threw the javelin with a fury that looked less like competition and more like exorcism, and he was gifted enough to earn a scholarship to the University of Southern California. For a few months, in 1954, he was a college athlete with a future pointing in one direction. Then he tore his shoulder in practice. The scholarship dissolved, and he was a 19-year-old nobody in Los Angeles with no plan. He drifted. He worked odd jobs. And then, almost by accident, he wandered into an acting class at Warner Brothers, and something happened in that first afternoon that he would spend the rest of his career trying to describe. The camera saw something in him that he had never been able to see in himself. He changed his name to Michael Landon, chosen from a phone book because he liked the sound of it. Within 2 years, he was on screen in a picture called I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and the audiences who filled drive-ins that summer left talking not about the monster, but about the boy underneath it. By 1959, when Bonanza premiered on NBC, Michael Landon was 22 years old and playing Little Joe Cartwright, the youngest and most headstrong son of Ben Cartwright's Ponderosa Empire. Bonanza was not supposed to work. It was the first Western filmed for color television, at a time when color sets were still a luxury. But something happened when those four Cartwright men rode across the titles together. America adopted them not as entertainment, but as family. At its peak, Bonanza was the most watched program in the country, and Little Joe was the one the audience looked to when they needed to feel something. Landon played him with a combination of quick temper and deep sweetness that could not be manufactured because it was not manufactured. It was the real man, the boy who had grown up holding on to joy with both hands because he had seen early enough what it looked like when joy decided to leave. He played Little Joe for 14 years. When Bonanza ended in 1973, people grieved in a way that surprised the network. They were not missing a show. They were missing a family. He could have stopped there. Instead, he sat down and wrote.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
He had always written, even during the Bonanza years, filling notebooks with the honest, emotional landscapes he had been exploring his whole life. What he wrote next was Little House on the Prairie. It premiered in the fall of 1974 and ran for 9 seasons. Charles Ingalls wept openly and admitted fear and told his daughters he loved them plainly in the middle of their fields and churches and kitchens. And the men who watched that show, the ones who would never quite admit it, felt something shift in them, because here was a man who understood that strength was not silence. That strength was staying. After Little House came Highway to Heaven in 1984, a show about an angel sent to help ordinary people in crisis. The critics found it too gentle for the decade. But Landon had always known that grace, told honestly, could hit harder than any gunfight ever written. Highway to Heaven ran for 5 seasons and reached more than 60 countries. And then, in the spring of 1991, Michael Landon got a headache that would not go away. He ignored it the way he ignored everything inconvenient, because there was a crew waiting and a pilot in development called Us that he was pouring himself into with the total absorption of a man who only knew one speed. The headache persisted. He lost weight without trying. In late March, he walked into his doctor's office, expecting to be told he was working too hard. He walked out with a diagnosis that knocked the floor out. Pancreatic cancer, inoperable, spread to the liver and lymph nodes, weeks, not months. He went home to his wife Cindy and sat with it. He had 9 children across 3 marriages. He had known failure and guilt and the specific loneliness of a man whose public warmth had always made it harder, not easier, to be truly known. Cindy held him in those first hours with the completeness of someone preparing, without knowing it, to be exactly this kind of strength. He would say later, in the weeks before he died, that he had no idea until that afternoon how thoroughly another person could hold you up when you had nothing left to stand on. On the 8th of April, 1991, he held a press conference. He stood in front of cameras, looking thinner than anyone was prepared for, wearing the smile that had lived in people's homes for 30 years, and he told the world what was happening. He was not going to disappear. He had spent 3 decades in the public's living room, and he owed them the truth. The response was staggering. Thousands of letters, inside 2 days. Fans who had grown up with Little Joe, parents who had watched Little House with their children on Monday nights and felt in Charles Ingalls some vision of the father they were trying to be. The letters did not read like correspondence to a celebrity. They read like letters to a family member, because that is what 30 years of honest, present storytelling had made him. 3 weeks after the press conference, Landon called Johnny Carson's office. Their connection ran deeper than the public knew. Landon had appeared on The Tonight Show more than a dozen times, and what existed between them was not the cordial professionalism of 2 Hollywood names. They were both deeply private men performing in profoundly public roles. When Landon called, Carson took the phone himself. The conversation lasted just over 10 minutes. Carson said yes before Landon had finished asking, and then he said something that stayed with everyone in that office who overheard it. Come on, and let's just talk. Like we always have. Forget the rest. Just come talk to me. A pause on Landon's end. Then he said, that is all I needed to hear. The taping was set for the 9th of May, 1991. Fred DeCordova, The Tonight Show's longtime executive producer, prepared quietly. The other guests scheduled for that evening were told the format might shift. Every one of them said the same thing without hesitating. Do whatever you need to do. On the afternoon of May 9th, Michael Landon arrived at NBC Studios with Cindy beside him. He wore a dark blazer over a pale blue shirt, chosen with the deliberate care of a man who understood that this would be among the last images many people had of him. He wanted to look like himself, not like a symbol, not like a sick man. Like Michael Landon, still here, still with things to say. The makeup artist who worked with him that afternoon had been at NBC for over a decade. She would tell people afterward that the man in her chair was the most fully present person she had ever encountered in that building. He asked about her family. He said, "The only regret is the thing you didn't try." She excused herself briefly to compose herself in the hallway. When she came back, he had noticed. He said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that." She said, "Please don't apologize." He smiled. Force of habit. Subscribe right now, because what happened in that green room 40 minutes before the cameras rolled is the part of this story that almost nobody knows. Drop your location in the comments. You need to be here for this. When Johnny Carson came to the green room himself, the production staff noticed and mentioned it to each other quietly. Carson had a pre-show ritual that was inviolable, understood by his team as the price of 30 years of this particular excellence. But on this evening, he walked down the hallway without his producer, knocked twice, and came in alone. He closed the door behind him. No cameras, no assistants. Just the two of them in a small room with the distant sound of the Tonight Show band running its warm-up in the studio below. What they said to each other in those 40 minutes was theirs, and it remained theirs. But before Carson stood to leave, Michael Landon reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and withdrew a folded piece of paper. He pressed it into Carson's hand and said, "Read it after the show." Not before, just after. Carson looked down at it. He looked at his friend. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was holding something in. He placed the paper carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, put his hand briefly on Landon's shoulder, and they walked down the hallway toward the stage together without saying anything, because there was nothing left that needed to be said before the cameras. The Tonight Show taped at 5:30 in the evening for broadcast at 11:30 that night, and when Michael Landon came through that curtain, the studio audience rose before the introduction was finished. They stood the moment his face appeared in the light, the face that had ridden horses across the Ponderosa and built barns in Walnut Grove and walked the roads of America as a patient angel who refused to stop believing in people. 300 strangers got to their feet, and what came out of them was not the usual bright excitement of an audience greeting a celebrity. It was something older and more serious. A room of people saying out loud the only thing they had felt since the press conference 31 days ago. "We see you. We are here. Come in." Carson was already standing, had been standing, from the moment he felt the quality of that applause change. He walked to the edge of the stage and held his friend, and the extra beat of it, the half second past what was comfortable or controlled, said everything the conversation in the green room had not found words for. When they settled at the desk and the guest chair and faced each other, neither man tried to make the moment smaller than it was. "You look good," Carson said. Landon's smile arrived without effort. "I look like a man who spent 30 years in the California sun and recently received some complicated news," he said. "But I'm dressed well." The laughter from that audience was real and enormous, and so grateful it was almost painful to hear, because it broke something 300 people had been carrying tightly since he walked through the curtain. Landon had known exactly what he was doing. That was the thing people sometimes underestimated about him beneath the warmth and the easiness. He was a craftsman. He had been studying audiences since he was 20 years old, and he could read a room the way a musician reads notation, with precision and without effort. They talked about the good years, Bonanza, the early days in Burbank, the horses on the Ponderosa set. An afternoon they filmed a scene in such high wind that every line got swallowed before it reached the camera, and the whole thing had to be moved 40 feet downhill into a ditch to get out of the gust. He told it well. Carson was laughing. The audience was laughing. For a few minutes it felt, in the way great storytelling always makes things feel, like everything was fine. Then Carson shifted in his chair. The way his staff had learned over 30 years meant the temperature was about to change, and he asked the question that was already in the room. "How are you doing, Michael?" And the way he said it left no room for the surface answer. Landon looked at him. He looked at the camera. He looked out at the audience. At 300 people who had risen for him not because he was famous, but because he had been in their homes every week for 30 years, and they had grown to love him in the private way that you love the people whose voices you know. He took a breath that was slower and quieter than any he had taken since walking onto the stage. "I'm doing better than I probably look," he said, "and I'm more scared than I'm letting on." He paused. "But I think that's about right for this situation." The room was completely still. "I made peace with dying a long time ago," he continued, and his voice was even and unhurried in the way that voices get when they have finally set down what they have been carrying. "I don't mean I expected this. Nobody expects this. But when you grow up the way I did, when you find your mother and you're 11 years old, and you understand in 1 second what you are looking at, you spend the rest of your life making peace with endings. Because you understand early that nothing is guaranteed. Not a single morning, not a single meal with the people you love. And that is not a tragedy." He said it the way Charles Ingalls would have said it to one of his daughters in the lamplight after something hard had happened. That is the whole truth. That is the thing we spend our lives running from, and that turns out, when we finally stop, to be the thing that made all of it matter. Carson had not moved. He was watching his friend with the specific, focused attention of a man trying to memorize something. "What I keep thinking about," Landon said, "is the things that were real. Because there is a certain clarity that comes with what the doctors told me. The noise goes away, all of it. The arguments with networks, the years when the outcome was uncertain, none of it weighs very much anymore. What weighs something is the faces of your children. What weighs something is every morning you chose to show up. What weighs something is the person next to you when the room gets quiet and you both already know what isn't going to be said." He looked out at the audience. "I'm 54 years old," he said. "I got to be Little Joe and Charles Ingalls and Jonathan Smith. I got to be 9 times a father. I got to fall in love and make mistakes and fall in love again. I got to make things that people remember." His voice carried something underneath the words now, a resonance the words alone could not contain. "I'm not going to pretend I don't get angry sometimes. That would be a lie, and I never did very well with lying. But mostly, what I feel is grateful. Mostly, what I feel is that I used it. That I took what I was given and I used it all the way up." Hit the like button right now if this story is reaching you. Tell me where in the world you are watching from, because Michael Landon looked into that camera and spoke directly to you. Carson asked about the children. Landon talked about them with full individual weight, each one their own person, each name spoken with an obvious, specific love that made you feel you knew them. He talked about his younger children with Cindy, about the urgency of wanting to leave them memories strong enough to hold them up later. Not the memory of a television star, the memory of a man who was present, who showed up for the school play and the baseball game and the Saturday morning silence. A man they could feel in a room even years after he was gone. The memory, he said quietly, of a father who loved them in a way they never had to wonder about. Then he turned and looked directly into the main camera. Not the angle that caught his profile, the lens that went straight out into the living rooms of the country that had spent 30 years watching him. And he said something that made the Tonight Show control room go absolutely silent. If there is someone watching this tonight who has gotten bad news, or who is sitting with something at 3 in the morning trying to figure out how to begin, I want you to hear me. You are not alone. The thing that is happening to you does not decide what you are. You are still yourself. You are still here. He paused, and the pause held the weight of everything he had spent his life understanding. I know it doesn't feel that way at 3 in the morning, but every day you are still here is a day you can love somebody. Every day you are here is a day you can make someone laugh. Every day you are here is a day the story is still being written, and no one has the right to tell you it is finished before it is finished. Not the doctors, not the calendar, nobody. The studio was perfectly still. 300 people and not one sound. I have had 30 years on camera, Landon said. I have played 3 different men who all tried to do the same thing. They tried to stay. They tried to be there. For their families, for the people around them, for strangers who needed something they could offer. And if anything I made was worth anything, if there is something in all these years that deserves to outlast me, it is that. Stay, show up, be present. Because your presence is the only thing that truly lasts. Not the awards, not the ratings. Your presence in the lives of the people who needed you to be there. That is what gets carried forward. He stopped. He looked at Carson. Carson looked back. 2 men who had spent their careers learning to be in front of cameras while carrying the private knowledge that cameras could not see everything. Smash that subscribe button right now, because what comes next is the moment nobody in that studio was ready for, and you need to be here for the end of this story. Drop your country in the comments. Carson asked about the work left unfinished, the pilot that had been interrupted. Landon talked about it with the specific bittersweet quality of a man describing an unfinished sentence. It had been about a family, about ordinary people trying to stay connected in the middle of ordinary life, which had been the only subject he had ever really been interested in, regardless of what costume the story wore. He described what it would have been, and the audience listened the way you listen to something beautiful that you know you will not get to have. But then Landon said something that shifted the weight. He said, I've been thinking about unfinished things, and I think an unfinished story is its own kind of statement. It tells people you were still going, that you hadn't run out of things to say. He smiled in a way that was tired and genuinely peaceful at the same time. That's not the worst thing to leave behind. When Michael Landon finally rose from the guest chair to leave, the audience rose with him, spontaneously, completely, as if the movement came from something other than individual will. The ovation that filled that studio was long and honest, and carried within it a grief that had nowhere else to go. Landon stood in the middle of it, with his shoulders back, and the smile that had lived in people's homes for 30 years, and he did not rush it, and he did not deflect it. He let it come, and let it find him. Carson walked him to the edge of the stage. The cameras followed. The audience was still standing. At the curtain, Landon stopped. He turned and looked at Carson, the way people look at things they are saying goodbye to without using the word, quietly, completely, without looking away. He said something that was just for Carson, low enough that it nearly dissolved in the applause. Take care of yourself, John. Carson's jaw tightened. He reached out and took Landon's hand in both of his and held it the way you hold something you are afraid of losing, not elegantly, not for the cameras, just with the full force of not wanting to let go. They held that grip for a long moment. Then Michael Landon walked back through the curtain, and the sound of his footsteps in the hallway behind it faded, and the audience listened until there was nothing left to hear. The episode aired at 11:30 that night, and by midnight, NBC's phone lines were overwhelmed. By the following morning, every major newspaper in the country was running the story, not as entertainment, as news. As something that belonged in the record of what the country had felt in the spring of 1991, mental health organizations reported a significant increase in people reaching out in the days that followed. Grief counselors reported the same. Families called each other. People finally asked the questions they had been too frightened to ask. Something Landon said that night, in those minutes when he looked directly into the camera, had given people permission, not just to grieve, to speak. After the broadcast, when the studio had emptied and the cameras were dark, Johnny Carson went to his dressing room, closed the door, and took the folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He opened it and read what was written there. The stage manager who knocked on his door 20 minutes later said Carson did not answer for a very long time. When he finally opened the door, his eyes were red. The stage manager asked if he needed anything. Carson was quiet for a moment. He said, "Michael wanted me to know something." He said this place, this show, was the one place in 30 years of doing all of this where nobody needed him to be anything other than what he actually was. He said to tell you all that it mattered. The stage manager did not say anything. Carson looked at the folded paper one more time. He creased it carefully back along its original lines and put it in his pocket. Michael Landon died on the 1st of July, 1991, at his home in Malibu, surrounded by Cindy and his children. He was 54 years old. He had lived 53 days after the taping. The news reached Carson in the morning and arrived with the force that things you have prepared for still carry, because no amount of knowing changes the silence of a world with someone subtracted from it. That evening, Carson opened his monologue without a joke. He stood at the desk and said the world had lost someone who understood what television was actually for. That Michael Landon had spent 30 years teaching people how to be human. That he was grateful. He meant it in a way that went past the cameras and into whatever private geography exists between two people who have mattered to each other. The footage from May 9th became one of the most requested recordings in NBC's archive. It was broadcast and rebroadcast and shown at memorials for people who had never met him but who had spent decades of their lives in his company. The moment where he looked into the camera and said, "You are not alone," became something that people shared in hospitals and waiting rooms and in the specific small hours when they needed to believe something true about the world. His son Christopher became a filmmaker. His daughter Jennifer became an actress. The others built their lives in the directions that were theirs, and none of them had any difficulty knowing who their father was, because he had stood in front of a camera at the end of his life and used every ounce of 30 years of craft and love to say, plainly and without performance, the things that mattered. Those things, once said in front of that many people, became permanent. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It walks through a curtain in a dark blazer and a pale blue shirt and sits down in a chair and tells the truth in a room full of people who love you and have come to say goodbye. And it does not flinch, and it does not perform, and it does not make itself smaller to make other people comfortable. Michael Landon chose that courage on the 9th of May, 1991. He could have stayed in Malibu and faced what he was facing in the privacy he had every right to. Instead, he called Johnny Carson and said, "Let's just talk, like we always have. Forget the rest." And in those 93 minutes, he did something that no character he had ever played had fully done. He showed people who he actually was. Not Little Joe, not Charles Ingalls, not Jonathan Smith. Michael, the boy who threw the javelin with everything he had, and then picked a name from a phone book and spent the next 30 years making it mean something. A man who had been given more than he ever had any right to expect, and who made sure none of it went to waste. He told Johnny Carson to read the note after. He told the camera that you are not alone. He told the audience that every day you are here is a day the story is still being written. And then he walked back through the curtain for the last time. And the story was still being written. And it is still being written now. In every person who watched that night and felt something shift. In every room where someone reached for a screen in the dark and found, unexpectedly, a man who already knew exactly what they needed to hear. If this story moved something in you tonight, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we are here every week with the stories that remind you what it means to be human. The moments when fame and vulnerability collide and something true gets said in front of 30 million people. Hit the hype button if you see it, because it helps this channel carry stories like this to the people who need them. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from tonight, because Michael Landon looked into that camera and said you are not alone, and I want to know where in the world those words have reached. Tell me your city. Tell me your country. Tell me your name if you want, because the distance between that stage and your living room has always been nothing. It has always been the same room. Michael Landon knew that the very first time he stood in front of a camera, and he never once forgot it. Not even at the end. Not even when everything else was being taken from him. He knew that to be truly seen by someone who shows up for you in the middle of the night is to be less alone. And no diagnosis, no calendar, no doctor's careful language can take that away. Not from him. And not from you.